In the grandeur of Windsor Castle, guests expected a routine royal banquet. But Charles's icy gaze, Catherine's trembling hands, and an eerie hush foreshadowed something no one was prepared for. The evening had begun like any other state occasion. Gilded invitations, gowns glinting under chandeliers, and the faint sound of violins weaving through polite conversation. Yet beneath the pomp, something was brewing. The air felt charged, almost electric, as though everyone sensed that the walls themselves were holding their breath. Charles arrived later than expected, his face drawn, and his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that unsettled even the most seasoned courtiers. From the moment he entered, he deliberately avoided the eyes of both Camilla and William, each seated at opposite ends of the long banquet table. Camilla, resplendent yet stiff, tried to catch his attention with a half-hearted smile that quickly dissolved when his gaze passed over her as if she were invisible. William, meanwhile, sat silent, his jaw tight, as though he already suspected something was amiss. Catherine sat next to him, dressed in an uncharacteristically regal ensemble, more queen than consort, which drew quiet whispers from nearby guests who couldn't help but notice the calculated elegance of her appearance. Every detail of her presence tonight seemed intentional, yet her fingers betrayed her, clutching the napkin on her lap as though she were bracing for impact. Palace staff moved differently that evening, exchanging furtive glances and walking briskly to and from the doors, their faces pale with suppressed urgency. The usual calm professionalism of the royal aides was gone, replaced with an unmistakable sense of alarm cloaked in ceremony. At the far end of the hall, two senior guards took up positions by a side entrance, their rigid stances suggesting they were expecting someone or something that required more than mere pageantry. Guests began to notice how unusually tight security felt tonight, and the sight of several members of Parliament seated among them only deepened the intrigue. As dinner unfolded, conversation waned, and an undercurrent of speculation rippled quietly from table to table. "Have you heard? The king's final speech," one guest murmured to another before being shushed by her companion, their eyes darting nervously toward the head of the table. The rumors swirled like a gathering storm. Some insisted it was a routine address about royal charity. Others, bolder, whispered of a shocking confession that had kept him awake for nights. But no one could say for certain, only that the air was thick with foreboding. As the final course is cleared, the clinking of cutlery is replaced by stunned silence when Charles finally rises, his expression somber yet resolute. When Charles uttered the words, "It ends with me," jaws dropped. Nobody could have anticipated what he was about to do next, and who he'd crown in his place. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the very walls of Windsor recoiled from his confession. With steady breath but a quivering voice, Charles began to speak of his reign, not as a triumph, but as a wound that never healed. He spoke of sleepless nights, of a heavy crown that felt more like a chain, and of choices he could never escape. Every word carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime imprisoned by duty, and yet even now, was unafraid to shatter the illusions around him. He spoke of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, and how her shadow still loomed over every step he took. He admitted that her perfection and unflinching resolve had haunted him from the moment he inherited the throne. No matter how hard he tried, he could never escape the quiet judgment of her memory, the relentless comparisons, or the sense that his reign was doomed to be a pale echo of hers. With every sentence, his voice hardened and then cracked, until finally he whispered it again, "It ends with me." For a heartbeat, the hall was frozen in disbelief. Then the realization struck that the king had just declared his abdication. Camilla's gasp was sharp enough to pierce the silence, her face pale with fury and shock. Her hands clutched the tablecloth, as though to anchor herself to a reality that was slipping away. Catherine's breath caught audibly, her panic written across her face as her eyes darted toward William, who sat motionless, his expression unreadable but his knuckles whitening on the edge of his chair. The guests, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing, exchanged frantic whispers. A few heads turned toward Parliament members seated among them, who wore equally stunned expressions. Even the palace aides, trained to remain unflappable, were visibly shaken, glancing at one another in silent confusion. Yet Charles stood tall, his eyes unblinking, his resolve ironclad. With a sharp gesture, he signaled to the aides, and two of them immediately disappeared into the shadows, before returning moments later carrying an ancient crown atop a velvet cushion and a single, weathered document sealed with the royal insignia. The sight of that crown, older than the memory of anyone present, sent another ripple through the hall. and the air thickened with an almost unbearable anticipation. But as he turns to face Catherine, his next words slice through the tension like a blade, throwing the monarchy and family into chaos. As Charles called Catherine forward, bypassing William entirely, the air turned suffocating. Why her? Why now? Every eye in the hall fixed on Catherine as though the entire fate of the monarchy hung on her next breath. Charles, his voice unwavering despite the chaos he'd unleashed, declared with grim finality that Catherine alone embodied the monarchy's future. Not William, not Camilla, but the woman who had, until tonight, been little more than a consort waiting silently in her husband's shadow. His words, sharp and deliberate, cut through centuries of tradition, as he explained that William lacked the conviction to carry the crown into a new era, an era that demanded ruthless honesty, not comfortable denial. Hints of William's resistance hung in the room like a storm cloud, as Charles alluded to truths. His son refused to confront truths about the institution, about duty, and about the price of survival. William sat rigid, his shoulders stiff with rage and humiliation, while his father's veiled accusations hung over him like a curse. Catherine, however, did not rise. For several heartbeats, she remained rooted to her chair, visibly shaken, as though the weight of the crown already pressed upon her. Her fingers dug into the table, her face pale, her eyes darting helplessly between her husband and the king. She looked at William once pleading, almost apologetic, but there was no sanctuary in his gaze. When she finally stood, her movements were hesitant, almost mechanical, as if each step toward her new destiny cost her pieces of herself she wasn't sure she could spare. Around them, nobles erupted into a dissonant chorus of confused applause and nervous murmuring. Some clapped simply because they didn't know what else to do. Others exchanged dark, worried glances, as if realizing they were witnessing not a celebration, but the beginning of a fracture that could tear the family, and perhaps the crown itself, apart. William's jaw tightened visibly, his knuckles bone-white as he gripped the table. He refused to meet Catherine's eyes as she passed him, as though every ounce of his self-control was devoted to not erupting where he sat. Meanwhile, Camilla's fury was a fire barely contained, her lips moving in a furious whisper to an aide as she gestured wildly toward the king and Catherine, her expression a cocktail of rage and disbelief. Yet even as the crown neared Catherine's head, the shadows of betrayal and unspoken family secrets threatened to ruin everything. Camilla's voice cut through the hall. "You can't do this!" And suddenly the royal facade crumbled before everyone's eyes. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to shatter, as her words echoed against the high walls, silencing the last murmurs of confusion. Rising from her seat with a fury that startled even the most stoic guests, Camilla hurled accusation after accusation at Charles. Her voice, sharp and dripping with contempt, painted him as a traitor to their shared sacrifices and years of quiet scheming. She demanded to know how he could stand there, in front of the world, and humiliate her so publicly. Her hands trembled as she pointed at Catherine, calling her a usurper, a pawn in some cruel game that neither she nor the guests had seen coming. She claimed she had sacrificed everything, her reputation, her dignity, her own family's peace, just to stand beside Charles, through scandal and silence. And now, she spat, he had discarded her like yesterday's gossip, all for the sake of a younger, prettier image of what the monarchy ought to be. Guests sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between the queen and the king, unable to decide where to look or what to believe. Some instinctively reached for their phones under the table, recording discreetly, capturing the moment history split open in real time. A few tried to whisper to one another but found even their voices betrayed them. Meanwhile, Catherine leaned ever so slightly toward William, her lips moving just enough to release words only he could hear. Whatever she said, it struck him like a blow. His head snapped toward her, his face darkening as though a private betrayal had just been unearthed, one even deeper than his father's public betrayal of him. His fury rose silently, but visibly, his chest heaving as he gripped the table harder, the veins in his neck straining against the weight of his silence. Through it all, Charles stood still, unyielding, his face like stone. Not a flinch, not a flicker of regret, as Camilla's voice cracked and rose, her rage spilling out in waves. His silence was a weapon, his composure almost cruel. When she realized he would not answer her, Camilla's rage finally reached its breaking point. With one final, searing look at both Charles and Catherine, She spun on her heels and stormed out of the hall. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, leaving a trail of gasps and murmurs in her wake. But as the doors slammed behind her, Catherine was left facing a choice that could shatter her marriage and the monarchy forever. Behind closed doors, William's heartbreak turns into rage. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispers, his eyes wet with betrayal. The words hang between them, heavy and unrelenting, filling the silence of the chamber with a tension that no crown could contain. Catherine recoils at his tone, her lips parting as if to speak. But no sound escapes her at first. William steps closer, his fists clenched, accusing her of having colluded with Charles all along, of playing a part in this cruel spectacle. His voice cracks as he asks how long she's known, how long she's been waiting for this moment while he was left standing in the shadows. Catherine, breathless and trembling, shakes her head and insists she had no idea that she too was blindsided by Charles's announcement. Her words spill out hurriedly, desperate to convince him that she is just as trapped in this nightmare as he is. But William's eyes narrow, his jaw tight with suspicion, and he throws back her words as though they're nothing but rehearsed excuses. He accuses her of letting herself be used, of stepping into the light even as it burned him alive. And in that quiet room, the future King of England is reduced to something smaller. A man questioning not just his wife, but his place in his own family. For a moment, Catherine falters, and the strength she summoned at the banquet collapses beneath her. She looks at him with tearful eyes and asks softly, "Do you still trust me?" The words are fragile, almost pleading, and they strike him in a way that disarms his anger, if only for a second. But the hurt in his eyes remains. And though his shoulders slump, he cannot bring himself to answer. William admits finally with a bitterness that surprises even him that he feels sidelined and humiliated, stripped of the destiny he thought was his. Catherine listens in silence as he confesses that standing next to her tonight felt like standing in the shadow of something he was never meant to own. And though her tears begin to fall, she gathers herself enough to tell him why she couldn't refuse. Her voice breaks as she explains her fears for the monarchy, how she believed someone had to carry it forward before it was swallowed whole by scandal and indifference. She says she accepted not for ambition, but because she couldn't watch the family or the nation collapse. But her explanation only deepens the chasm between them. William stares at her for a long, hollow moment before he turns and walks away, his silence more damning than any words he might have spoken. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, whispers grow louder as news of the abdication begins leaking beyond the castle walls. As dawn broke over Windsor, the palace became a battlefield, courtiers choosing sides between the old and the new order. The night's chaos had only deepened with the silence of the early morning. But inside the castle walls, the storm raged on. Senior royals gathered in hushed clusters throughout the corridors and drawing rooms, their voices low but urgent, debating how to respond to the king's declaration and Catherine's unexpected rise. Some argued for immediate acceptance of the new queen-to-be, claiming it was Charles's prerogative as sovereign. Others insisted this decision was reckless, even dangerous, threatening the very fabric of the monarchy. What began as whispers of confusion quickly hardened into lines of loyalty and defiance. Members of Parliament seated at the banquet had not slept. Instead, they made frantic phone calls deep into the night, and through the morning, speaking in clipped tones about constitutional implications and what legal mechanisms might still be available to stop this coronation before it became irreversible. Some questioned whether the king even retained the authority to bypass the heir apparent in such a blatant fashion, while others worried that public support would evaporate if Parliament attempted to interfere. In the palace itself, the staff, so often the unseen machinery of royal life, became players in the drama. Senior aides to Charles moved swiftly to pledge allegiance to Catherine, assuring her of their loyalty and quietly congratulating her. But others, unable or unwilling to serve a monarch imposed by what they called a betrayal of tradition, resigned on the spot, leaving their lanyards and keys on the polished wooden desks as they departed. Even the royal guards who lined the corridors appeared conflicted, their eyes darting nervously between portraits of past monarchs and the woman now poised to wear the crown. For the first time in living memory, no one could say with certainty whom the royal household truly served. Outside the castle, speculation mounted about a possible parliamentary intervention, a vote, a motion, perhaps even an emergency session, to block Catherine's coronation if it came to that. Rumors began to circulate that certain ministers were already drafting language to declare the succession invalid. But others warned that such a move would only plunge the monarchy into deeper chaos, and perhaps end it altogether. In the center of it all, Charles disappeared. Retreating into his private study, he locked the doors and refused to meet anyone, leaving courtiers and politicians alike to navigate the wreckage of his decision without guidance. His absence only inflamed the panic, fueling whispers that the king himself might not be entirely in control anymore. But as tensions reached a fever pitch, another shocking revelation emerged, one that would question the very legitimacy of the crown itself. A single letter, hidden among Queen Elizabeth's personal effects, threatened to expose everything and destroy the royal family from within. As the palace tore itself apart, an unassuming aide stumbled upon a small, weathered envelope sealed with the late queen's insignia. It was tucked inside a carved wooden box, left forgotten among her private papers. The aide hesitated only a moment before delivering it to Charles, who sat alone, brooding in his study. As he tore it open, the room seemed to contract around him, the weight of its contents heavier than any crown. The letter began as a reflection, almost maternal in tone, but quickly turned into something far darker. In precise, deliberate language, Elizabeth questioned William's suitability to inherit the throne. Her words spoke of his unyielding pride, his inability to see beyond his own wounds, and a quiet fear that he might fail to protect the monarchy when its survival depended most on clarity and sacrifice. But then came the most shocking passage, her admiration for Catherine. She described her as the steady hand the future demands, a woman of quiet resolve and unshakable composure, someone who could carry forward what others could not. And then, near the end, the Queen's words became cryptic. She wrote of sins of the father, of truths buried beneath decades of silence, and of a need to set things right before it's too late. Charles read these lines over and over, his hands trembling, his breath uneven. Here was vindication, but also condemnation of his father, of himself, of the entire line he had fought to preserve. He clutched the letter to his chest, as though it might keep him from breaking completely. William was told of the letter by one of the aides, but refused to read it himself. His anger flared, his disbelief absolute, dismissing it as another manipulation. He claimed the words must have been twisted, or worse, fabricated, unwilling to entertain the idea that his grandmother could have doubted him so profoundly. But the silence in the room, when the letter was read aloud to the others, left little room for denial. Catherine, when finally handed the letter, unfolded it with trembling fingers. As she read, her face paled, her breath shallow. Every word seemed to etch itself into her skin, not as a triumph, but as a burden she had never asked for. The realization that this choice had been set in motion long before she had a say in it settled over her like a shadow she could not escape. With the Queen's own words backing Charles's shocking choice, the path seemed inevitable until an unexpected visitor arrived at Windsor gates. Princess Anne, silent until now, walked into the hall like a storm, and her words threatened to undo everything. The room stilled at the sound of her heels against the marble floor, a sound that seemed to grow louder with every step she took toward the center. She fixed her eyes on Charles first, her gaze sharp and unflinching, and when she finally spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had seen more than anyone else dared to admit. In a voice both cold and cutting, she accused him outright of cowardice, of hiding behind grand gestures and reckless decrees because he lacked the courage to confront the truth about himself. Her words landed like blows, each more brutal than the last, calling him a king who would rather burn the family to the ground than face his own failings. She swept her attention to the entire hall now, her voice rising, declaring that the family was tearing itself apart just to appease the ghosts of the past, ghosts that could no longer hurt them, but which they still let dictate every choice. She warned that this obsession with correcting history would only ensure there was no future left to inherit. The monarchy, she said, could not endure if it kept devouring its own in the name of redemption. Then she turned her gaze to Catherine. The air thickened as she spoke directly to her, telling her flatly that wearing the crown would not make her untouchable, it would make her a target, that enemies would surround her from within and without, and that she would find herself isolated and hunted in ways she could not yet imagine. It was not delivered as a threat, but as a prophecy, one that chilled even the most hardened among them. She did not stop there. Anne went further, challenging the very legitimacy of what had just transpired. With a defiant tone, she reminded everyone present that a coronation was not merely a spectacle to appease the whims of a fractured king, but a sacred rite with rules that even the sovereign could not bend at will. Her words tore through the pretense of order and grandeur, leaving even the most loyal supporters glancing at one another, questioning what they had just witnessed. And then, silence. Her voice faded, but the echoes of her defiance clung to the walls, impossible to ignore. Even Charles, for the first time that night, looked away. But as Anne's words echoed through the stone walls, the ceremonial doors swung open, signaling that history, whether they were ready or not, was about to be made. With trembling hands, Catherine knelt. The weight of the crown bore down on her like the weight of history itself, and the monarchy would never be the same again. The hall fell into a hush, so deep it felt almost unnatural, as though every breath in the room had been stolen. Charles re-entered, now clad in full regalia, the ancient symbols of kingship adorning him in solemn splendor. His expression was unreadable, but his steps were deliberate, heavy with finality. Every pair of eyes followed him as he moved to the center of the room, where Catherine waited. Her head bowed but her spine rigid, caught between defiance and surrender. Catherine rose slightly and stepped forward, her movements slow, measured, as though she could feel every hostile glance that followed her across the marble floor. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional sharp whisper or muffled gasp. Around her, courtiers clung to the edges of the room, their faces pale with confusion, fear, and fury all at once. Every whispered doubt and private resentment crackled in the air, but none dared speak aloud. This moment belonged to her now, and to the man who had forced it into being. When the crown was finally placed on her head, the hall seemed to exhale, but it was not relief that swept through the room. It was the bitter understanding that this act had split the family forever. The ancient metal felt impossibly heavy, pressing down not just on her head but on her very soul. She closed her eyes for a breath, and when she opened them, it was done. There was no turning back. In the shadows, William watched her with dark, unblinking eyes. His expression betrayed nothing but his clenched jaw and tightened fists spoke volumes. There was resolve in his gaze now, but also something colder than the faintest glint of a battle yet to come. Whatever promise once bound them together as husband and wife, it now hung frayed and fragile between them, and still, Camilla was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was deafening, her defiance echoing louder than if she'd stood there screaming. Somewhere beyond those doors, she was already plotting what came next, and everyone in that hall knew it. Charles leaned toward Catherine just as the last word of the ceremony faded into silence. He whispered something, inaudible to the rest but enough to make her draw in a sharp, quiet breath. Then he stepped aside without looking back, leaving her alone on the throne, a figure both triumphant and utterly alone. As the cameras flashed, and the nation waited for her first words as queen, one question hung heavy in the air. What price would she pay for the crown? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.